What are 4 common myths that you may be believing in that are holding you back from healing your childhood trauma? Hi, I'm Ewan the Therapist. Welcome to my channel. This is a channel where we look in and explore issues around healing childhood trauma. If that's something you're interested in, click on the like and subscribe button and you'll get updates on a regular basis. Now, today we're going to be looking at 4 common myths that many of us are caught in. Each of these myths I've gone through myself. I'll be taking you through what they are and what we can do to kind of counter these myths. And why we need to, because I think sometimes what happens in this healing childhood trauma journey, there are stories we kind of indulge in or believe in or identify with without necessarily being aware of it. They are really holding us back from moving forward. So let's go through each of these myths and what we can do to counter this. Now, the first one is something I went through, which is, come on, it wasn't that bad. And this is a very common, particularly in the beginning of our healing childhood trauma journey, where we look at what we've been through and we kind of shrug it off and say, well, it wasn't so bad. It happened, but, big deal kind of thing. And there's a feeling of where we minimize the gravity of what's occurred. And it's not to say everything we went through was terrible, but to get to the point where we're dealing with trauma and we're dealing with the symptoms of trauma, bad things did happen. And what happens is when we're in these environments growing up, often what happened to us was minimized by our caregivers. It was minimized by our environment. And we go through and kind of internalize that, where we just naturally minimize these things. There's also an element of loyalty. It feels, particularly in the beginning of the journey, to say, look, this happened and this abuse occurred or this neglect occurred. We feel maybe a disloyalty to our caregivers. And so it makes sense why we may do that. It also is a way of ensuring we don't we stay away from it. By saying it wasn't that bad means that we don't really have to look at the details and the depth of what really occurred. So what's important is to be able to say, look, if I'm at a point where I'm struggling with X and I'm struggling with Y, it's got its origin somewhere in some kind of trauma. And to be able to say, well, it was bad, this shouldn't have happened, or this should have happened, is a really critical part of this healing childhood trauma journey, because it's really about meeting our issues with a level of honesty, a level of yes, this did happen, it wasn't good, and it left me feeling this way. And that's a really critical starting point. The second myth, which is kind of leads on to this, is, okay, we get to the point where we say, okay, this was significant and this was bad. But then we say, well, others had it worse. Yes, others have been through more. This, and this didn't happen to me. So who am I to complain about this, and this? And that's how the kind of the logic goes. But the problem is it's a very faulty logic and it doesn't just really add up. Because it's like saying, well, look, someone, pinned me down and cut my hand off with a hacksaw. But there was another person had their hand and their legs cut off. Therefore, who am I to complain? Others had it worse. And even if that is the case, it doesn't take away the gravity of me having my hand cut off with a hacksaw. So this is the nature of comparison. Of course, there's always going to be someone that has it worse, in inverted commas. But we're not looking at other people. We're looking at ourselves, looking at what we went through, how we felt, what we experienced. And it's also a kind of a subtle way of, again, this kind of denial by saying others had it worse. Therefore, I don't really need to look at this. Therefore, it's not as bad as I'm saying. And it's all this kind of gradual kind of pushing away, this removing ourselves from this because, hey, others had it worse. It wasn't so bad. So getting to the point where we can say, look, whether others had it worse or not doesn't change the fact that this hurt, doesn't change the fact that this was significant. And they're 2 myths that kind of work together. We have to really look at how we dissolve this. The third myth is the myth of, I really just need to get on with my life, or I really need to just kind of move past this. There's no point dwelling on the past. We can call it the myth of, I just need to get on with my life. That feeling of, I don't want to spend the next 10 years talking about the first 10 years of my life. What's done is done, and we just need to kind of get on with things. That I'm just being a bit of a victim, I'm being a bit of a martyr. And, it's about the future. It's not about the past. And, I just need to move on. That's the story. I just need to move on. And the truth is none of us want to be stuck in some trauma loop where we're just going around in circle with a therapist. For sure, we assume that. But to begin with, there is this process of acknowledgement. There's this process of turning towards what's really here. And when we say, look, I just need to get on with my life, often behind that is denial, and there's also avoidance. Because the truth is, as we go through this healing process, we just naturally get on with things. We don't remain stuck in the past forever in that kind of way. So that process of just moving on happens naturally. But before we can get to that natural letting go, we have to go through the thing itself. And when we just say, look, I just got to get on with things, really that's the myth of by just turning away from it, it's just going to magically disappear. And lo and behold, it doesn't. So, that feeling of just denial, suppression, and just getting on, that's not really getting on with things. And it's also that sense of what we say, oh, that's all in the past. It isn't. It's showing up in the here and now, in struggles with relationships or addiction or whatever it may be. What we're dealing with is present moment conditions. And by healing, we're going back to kind of the origin of those. We're going back to understand like where they came into place in our body and our thoughts and feelings. So that's the third myth. And the last and the fourth myth is, I think, something that many of us go through. So we go to this process of acknowledging, okay, what happened was significant. What happened to others doesn't matter. I can't just kind of shove it down and get on with things. And then we're faced with the gravity of what's occurred, the gravity of where we are. And then we can go through this feeling of, I'm just too broken to heal. And that's the fourth myth. I'm just too broken. This is just too much. And it can be very despairing and it can feel very hopeless when we've kind of avoided this mountain of trauma all our lives, almost with the awareness of it's huge. And so we turn away our denial. We work through our avoidance and disassociation. Now we look at this giant mountain of stuff is what it feels like. And it just feels like it's too much. Like I'm just too far gone. I'm too broken. I'm too damaged. And it can feel self-evident. I know I had that. I had years of addiction where it just felt like I just cannot change. I just can't get out of this. I'm just too far gone. And to dissolve this myth, we have to trust in a certain level of process. We have to trust the testimony of others, that if others have been where we are and they've gotten to the other side of it, then it is possible. Because on one level, that's all we need to know. Not that we're going to get there instantly or it's just like immediately available to us, but it's doable. Even if it's slow and gradual, it's doable. So there's a level of trust. And I also think there's a level of we require resources. Like if we try and we try and we try and we just can't seem to do it, then there's something about that process where there's pieces missing. I had that myself with addiction, that until I had a certain amount of support, a certain amount of resources and capacity, then what felt impossible before suddenly becomes possible. So I think there are two ways to deal with that myth or dissolve that myth of I'm too broken. Is we have to trust the process, we have to trust the rationale that it's possible, and we also have to ensure we're resourced to be able to make that change. Because if we're not, it's not because we're too broken, it's like there's some component missing in that process, whether it's a good therapist, whether it's community, whatever it may be, rather than kind of feeling like it's a fault of ours or there's something we're just, too fundamentally flawed. So these are the four myths. I hope this has really helped. If you've got any feedback or you'd like to leave some input on what you've been through and maybe how you worked through these things, you can write in the comments section. Take care of yourself and bye-bye.